Before you were born, before your name ever had a sound, this world was already arranged. Not by chance, not by chaos. By a ruler who does not demand worship with fire and thunder, but with routine. Look closely at the architecture of reality, the endless repetition, the rules that punish curiosity and reward obedience, the way suffering is explained as necessary, and authority is called divine. This is not the universe of a boundless source. It is a kingdom engineered, measured, and tightly managed. Ancient voices whispered that this world was not created by the true God, but by a lesser ruler who mistook power for divinity. A ruler who crowned himself God and sealed his dominion not with chains but with belief. This is the story of how that kingdom formed, how consciousness was confined, and how an entire reality learned to mistake control for order. Once you see the structure, you cannot unsee it. In the centuries surrounding the beginning of the Common Era, a diverse collection of religious and philosophical movements emerged across the Mediterranean world and the Near East. These movements are now collectively referred to as Gnosticism, though that single term encompasses a wide variety of beliefs, texts, and communities. What united many of these traditions was a distinctive claim about the nature of reality itself. They proposed that the world we inhabit is not the creation of the highest divine power, but rather the work of a lesser being, a flawed or ignorant entity who either did not know of the true God or who actively obscured that knowledge from humanity. This being came to be known by several names, but most commonly as the demiurge, a Greek word meaning craftsman or artisan. The idea that our reality might be the product of a false or limited God was not born from paranoia or conspiracy. It emerged from genuine spiritual struggle. People in the ancient world experienced the same disconnect that many feel today, a sense that something fundamental is wrong with existence, that beneath the surface of ordinary life lies a deeper truth that has been hidden or forgotten. For the communities that developed Gnostic thought, this feeling was not merely philosophical speculation. It was lived experience. They saw empires rise and fall, witnessed injustice, faced persecution, and felt within themselves a longing for something beyond the material world. Their myths and teachings were attempts to name that longing and to explain why the world seemed designed to keep them from fulfilling it. To understand how these ancient thinkers arrived at the concept of a false god ruling this reality, we must first understand the world they inhabited. The Mediterranean basin in the first few centuries of the Common Era was a place of extraordinary religious diversity. Judaism had long established itself as a monotheistic tradition, but within Judaism there existed many schools of thought, from the Pharisees and Sadducees to the Essenes and various mystical movements. Christianity was just beginning to take shape, and it too was far from unified. There were communities that followed different teachers, emphasized different texts, and held vastly different understandings of who Jesus was and what his teachings meant. Alongside these traditions, ancient Greek philosophy continued to influence educated people throughout the region, particularly the ideas of Plato, whose work would profoundly shape Gnostic cosmology. In this environment of intellectual and spiritual ferment, certain groups began to develop a radical reinterpretation of creation itself. They read the opening chapters of Genesis not as a story of divine perfection, but as a story of tragic error. They looked at the figure described as creating the world and saw not the ultimate God, but a derivative power, one who claimed authority without possessing true wisdom. This interpretation was not arbitrary. It was rooted in close reading of sacred texts, combined with philosophical reasoning and mystical insight. The key texts that preserved these ideas were largely lost to history for many centuries. The early Christian church, as it consolidated its authority and defined orthodox belief, suppressed teachings it deemed heretical. Gnostic texts were destroyed and hidden or forgotten. For over 1,000 years, most of what was known about Gnosticism came from the writings of its opponents, church fathers who argued against these teachings and in doing so, preserved fragments of them. But in December of 1945, in the desert of Upper Egypt near the town of Nag Hammadi, a remarkable discovery changed everything. A farmer digging for fertilizer uncovered a sealed earthenware jar containing 13 ancient codices, bound books written in Coptic, a late form of the Egyptian language. These books contained more than 50 texts, many of them previously unknown, representing a diverse range of Gnostic Christian writings, including Gospels, Apocalypses, and philosophical treatises. The Nag Hammadi Library, as it came to be known, opened a window into a world of early Christian thought that had been almost entirely obscured. Among the texts found were the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Apocryphon of John, and the Hypostasis of the Archons. These writings revealed communities that understood the Christian message in ways dramatically different from what would become Orthodox Christianity. They preserved teachings that emphasized direct spiritual knowledge over institutional authority, inner transformation over external ritual, and a cosmology that located the source of human suffering not in human sin alone, but in the very structure of the cosmos. Central to many of these texts is the figure of the demiurge. In Gnostic thought, the demiurge is not the ultimate reality. Above and beyond the demiurge exists the true God, often described as the unknown Father, the invisible Spirit, or simply the One. This highest reality is characterized by perfect knowledge, fullness, and unity. It is beyond description, beyond gender, beyond limitation of any kind. From this ultimate source emanates a series of divine powers, often called aeons, which together constitute the pleroma, the fullness of divine being. These aeons exist in harmonious relationship, forming pairs and giving rise to further emanations, all sharing in the nature of the original source. The problem begins when one of these divine emanations, often named Sophia, which means wisdom, acts independently without the consent or participation of her divine partner. Different texts tell this story in different ways, but the essential pattern is consistent. Sophia, in her desire to know or to create, brings forth something flawed. What emerges from her solitary act is not another perfect aeon, but a distorted being, one who does not share in the fullness of divine knowledge. This being is the demiurge. Because he comes into existence apart from the proper order of emanation, he is ignorant of what lies above him. He does not know the true God. He does not recognize his own origin. And in his ignorance, he believes himself to be the highest power, the only God. This is a crucial point. In most Gnostic texts, the demiurge is not portrayed primarily as evil in the sense of being deliberately malicious. He is ignorant. His flaw is not hatred, but lack of knowledge. He is powerful but blind. He possesses creative ability but lacks wisdom. And because he does not know the true God, he mistakes himself for that God. This act of false identification is the beginning of what Gnostic texts describe as the fallen state of reality. The demiurge, believing himself to be supreme, sets about creating. He fashions the material cosmos, the world of form and matter. In doing so, he imitates the divine realm above, but his creation is necessarily imperfect because it is based on ignorance rather than knowledge. The world he makes is described in Gnostic texts as a shadow, a copy, or a prison. It contains beauty because it imitates the divine, but it also contains suffering, limitation, and death because it is separated from the true source of life. The material world is not inherently evil in most Gnostic systems, but it is fundamentally limited and limiting. It is a place where divine sparks can become trapped in matter, where souls can forget their origin, and where the light of true knowledge can be obscured. To govern this creation, the demiurge brings forth a host of subordinate powers. These beings are called archons, a Greek word meaning rulers or authorities. The archons function as cosmic administrators, maintaining the structures of the material world and, in many texts, actively working to keep human souls ignorant of their true nature. They are described as inhabiting the planetary spheres, controlling the movement of celestial bodies, and influencing the fates of human beings. In some texts, the archons are depicted as jailers, preventing souls from ascending back to their true home in the divine realm. In others, they are simply described as agents of the demiurge, carrying out his will without necessarily understanding the larger cosmic situation. The cosmology that emerges from these teachings is complex and varies significantly from text to text, but certain themes remain constant. Reality is understood as layered. At the top is the unknown, unknowable divine source. Below that are the realms of light, the pleroma where the true aeons dwell. Below that are intermediate regions, sometimes called the Ogdoad, or the realm of Sophia. And finally, at the bottom, is the material cosmos created and ruled by the demiurge and his archons. Human beings exist at the lowest level, in physical bodies, but within some humans resides a spark of the divine light, a fragment of the original spiritual substance that has become trapped in matter. This spark is not given by the demiurge. In fact, many Gnostic texts tell a story in which the demiurge inadvertently or unwillingly allows this divine element into his creation. In some versions, Sophia intervenes to place her light into humanity. In others, the very act of creation involves the demiurge using divine substance without understanding what he is doing. The result is that human beings become hybrid creatures, composed of material body, soul governed by the archons, and spirit that originates from beyond the material cosmos. The challenge of human existence in this framework is to recognize the divine spark within, to awaken to one's true origin, and to escape the dominion of the demiurge and his archons. The question then becomes, how did reality fall under the control of this false god? The answer, according to Gnostic thought, is through ignorance and forgetfulness. The fall is not a single event in the past, but an ongoing condition. Every soul that incarnates into a material body risks forgetting its divine origin. The physical world, with its demands and distractions, encourages identification with the body and the self, rather than with the spirit. The archons, whether deliberately or simply by nature, reinforce this forgetfulness. They establish systems of belief, codes of law, social structures, and religious institutions that direct human attention outward, toward the material and the authoritative rather than inward, toward the divine spark. In this view, the true fall is not moral transgression in the conventional sense, but epistemological failure. It is the loss of knowledge, the substitution of ignorance for awareness. The demiurge rules not through superior power in an absolute sense, but through the power that comes from not being recognized for what he is. As long as humans believe he is the true God, they remain under his authority. As long as they accept the material world as ultimate reality, they remain trapped within it. The kingdom of the false god is maintained not by chains, but by belief. This brings us to one of the most psychologically rich aspects of Gnostic thought, the idea that liberation comes through knowledge. The Greek word gnosis means knowledge, but not intellectual knowledge in the ordinary sense. It refers to direct, experiential awareness of spiritual truth. Gnosis is the recognition of one's true nature, the remembering of one's divine origin, the awakening from the dream of material existence. In Gnostic teaching, this knowledge cannot be given through doctrine or ritual alone. It must be experienced. It often comes through revelation, through encounter with a divine messenger who reminds the soul of what it has forgotten. In Christian Gnostic texts, Jesus frequently appears as this messenger. He is understood not primarily as a sacrifice for sin, but as a revealer of truth. He comes from the realm of light to remind human beings of their true home. His teachings, in this context, are not moral instructions so much as wake-up calls. He speaks to the divine spark within each person, calling it to recognize itself, to remember its source, and to begin the journey of return. This understanding of Jesus is radically different from Orthodox Christian teaching, which is one reason why Gnostic Christianity was ultimately suppressed by the institutional church. The historical development of these ideas is complex. Gnosticism did not emerge fully formed. It grew from a confluence of sources: Jewish mysticism, Platonic philosophy, early Christian revelation, and possibly influences from Persian Zoroastrianism and other Eastern traditions. Scholars continue to debate the precise origins and the degree to which different Gnostic systems influenced one another or drew from common sources. What is clear is that by the 2nd century of the Common Era, there existed numerous communities throughout the Mediterranean world that shared a basic Gnostic worldview, even as they differed in details. These communities were often small and secretive. They understood themselves as possessing hidden knowledge, passed down from teacher to student, revealed through mystical experience or found in texts that were not widely available. They met for rituals that emphasized spiritual transformation rather than communal worship in the conventional sense. They read and produced texts that reinterpreted traditional scriptures and recorded new revelations, and they saw themselves as a spiritual elite, not in the sense of social class or moral superiority, but in the sense of having awakened to a truth that most people remained blind to. The institutional church, as it developed hierarchical structures and standardized doctrine, viewed these groups with suspicion and hostility. From the perspective of emerging orthodoxy, Gnostic teachings were dangerous errors that led people away from true faith. Church fathers such as Irenaeus of Lyon wrote extensive refutations of Gnostic ideas attempting to demonstrate their logical inconsistencies and theological errors. These polemics often caricatured Gnostic beliefs, presenting them in the most extreme and offensive light possible. Yet despite this opposition, or perhaps because of it, we can see how seriously the early church took the Gnostic challenge. The debates about the nature of God, the meaning of creation, and the path to salvation that took place in the first few centuries of Christianity shaped the development of Christian theology in profound ways. One reason Gnostic ideas were so threatening to orthodoxy was that they undermined the authority of the institutional church. If salvation comes through direct knowledge, rather than through participation in church sacraments, then the church loses its role as gatekeeper to the divine. If the material world is the creation of an ignorant God rather than the good creation of the true God, then the church's emphasis on embodied community and physical ritual becomes questionable. If scripture must be read symbolically and esoterically rather than literally, then church authorities cannot claim exclusive rights to interpretation. The Gnostic vision was inherently decentralizing and individualistic in its spiritual epistemology, even as Gnostic communities maintained their own forms of structure and tradition. But we must be careful not to romanticize Gnostic movements or to project modern values onto them. These were not democracies of the spirit. They had their own hierarchies, their own forms of authority, their own ways of including and excluding. The emphasis on secret knowledge could lead to elitism. The dualism inherent in much Gnostic thought, the sharp distinction between spirit and matter, could and did lead to problematic ethical conclusions. Some Gnostic groups adopted extreme asceticism, denying the body to emphasize the spirit. Others, convinced that the material world was irrelevant to spiritual status, adopted a form of libertinism, arguing that actions in the flesh could not affect the spirit. Most, it seems, took a middle path, but the potential for extremes was built into the system. The cosmology of the demiurge also raises difficult questions about suffering and evil. If the creator of this world is ignorant rather than benevolent, then suffering is not a mystery to be reconciled with divine goodness, but a natural consequence of flawed creation. This can be oddly comforting as an explanation, offering a framework in which the harshness of existence makes sense. But it can also lead to a kind of cosmic despair, a sense that the world is fundamentally and irredeemably wrong. Different Gnostic texts handle this tension differently. Some maintain hope that the material creation will eventually be redeemed or dissolved, allowing all divine sparks to return to their source. Others suggest a more dualistic eternity, with matter and spirit remaining forever separate. Modern scholars approach Gnostic texts from multiple perspectives. Some read them as historical theology, trying to understand what these ancient communities actually believed and how their beliefs functioned socially and religiously. Others read them as mythology, analysing the symbolic systems and narrative structures. Still others approach them psychologically, seeing in Gnostic cosmology a map of the human psyche. This last approach has been particularly influential since the psychologist Carl Jung took a deep interest in Gnostic texts, finding in them descriptions of what he called the process of individuation, the journey towards psychological wholeness. From a psychological perspective, the demiurge can be understood as a symbol of the ego. The ego believes itself to be the centre of the personality, the ultimate authority. It creates its own version of reality based on limited perception and calls that reality truth. It establishes structures of belief and behaviour that it defends as necessary and absolute. But the ego is not the deepest aspect of the self. Beneath or beyond it lies what Jung called the self, the true centre of the personality, which has access to the collective unconscious and to patterns of meaning that transcend individual experience. The journey from ego identification to self-recognition parallels the Gnostic journey from ignorance to gnosis, from false god to true god. Similarly, the archons can be read as psychological complexes, autonomous patterns of thought and emotion that seem to rule us from within. These are the internalized voices of parents, culture and conditioning, the shoulds and musts that we mistake for our own thoughts. They are the habits of mind that keep us trapped in limiting stories about who we are and what is possible. Liberation, in this reading, comes through recognizing these patterns as patterns, seeing through them to the more fundamental awareness that precedes and contains them. This psychological interpretation does not replace the religious or philosophical meanings of Gnostic texts, but it does offer a way of engaging with them that many modern people find accessible. It suggests that the ancient Gnostics were describing inner experiences in the language of outer cosmology, that their myths of fallen gods and imprisoned light were attempts to articulate the felt sense of estrangement from one's true nature that many people experience. The philosophical dimension of Gnostic thought is equally rich. The Gnostic cosmology bears striking resemblance to Plato's allegory of the cave, presented in his dialogue The Republic. In that allegory, Plato describes prisoners chained in a cave, facing a wall on which shadows are projected. The prisoners mistake the shadows for reality, having never seen the actual objects that cast them, or the fire that provides the light. One prisoner is freed and dragged up out of the cave into the sunlight, where he gradually adjusts to seeing real objects and eventually the sun itself, which Plato identifies with the form of the good, the highest reality. When this freed prisoner returns to the cave to tell the others what he has seen, they do not believe him and may even become hostile, preferring their familiar shadows to a truth they cannot yet perceive. The parallels to Gnostic teaching are obvious. The cave is the material world created by the demiurge. The shadows are the illusions that keep souls trapped. The world outside the cave is the pleroma, the realm of true reality. The sun is the ultimate God, the source of all light and truth. The freed prisoner who gains true vision represents the one who receives gnosis. And the hostility of those who remain in the cave reflects the resistance that messengers of truth often face in a world governed by ignorance. Plato himself did not identify the creator of the material world as ignorant or false. In his dialogue Timaeus, he describes a divine craftsman, also called the demiurge, who fashions the material cosmos according to eternal patterns or forms. This demiurge is good and creates the best world possible within the limitations of matter. But later Platonic philosophers, particularly those in the movement known as Middle Platonism and Neoplatonism, developed increasingly complex metaphysical systems involving multiple levels of reality and emanation from a supreme principle. These systems provided intellectual scaffolding that Gnostic thinkers could adapt for their own purposes, recasting Plato's good craftsman as an ignorant pretender. The question of why Gnostic thinkers made this move, why they chose to interpret creation as a fall rather than as a reflection of divine goodness, brings us back to the problem of suffering. The world is beautiful but also brutal. Life involves growth but also decay. Consciousness allows for joy but also for anguish. How do we reconcile the existence of a good and omnipotent God with the reality of pain, injustice, and death? This is the classic problem of theodicy, and different religious traditions have offered different answers. Orthodox Christianity explains suffering as a consequence of human sin and the fallen state that resulted from disobedience in the Garden of Eden. It maintained that God's creation was originally good, that humans freely chose evil, and that suffering entered the world through that choice. Redemption comes through Christ's sacrifice, which atones for sin and opens the way to restored relationship with God. This framework preserves God's goodness by locating the source of evil in human free will rather than in divine creation. Gnostic Christianity offered a different answer. It located the problem not in human moral failure, but in the structure of reality itself. The world is flawed because its creator is flawed. Suffering is not punishment for sin, but a natural feature of a cosmos built on ignorance. This shifts the entire framework of salvation. The goal is not moral reformation or forgiveness of sins, though ethical behavior may still be valued. The goal is escape from the entire system, a return to the divine realm from which the Spirit originated. Salvation is not restoration to a lost paradise within this creation, but exit from creation altogether. This cosmology can be deeply appealing to those who feel that conventional religious explanations of suffering are inadequate. It names a feeling that many people have, that something is fundamentally wrong with the world as it is, that the authorities who claim to speak for God may themselves be ignorant or deceptive, and that truth requires looking beyond the accepted narratives. In this sense, Gnostic thought has often attracted those who feel marginalized by or skeptical of established religious institutions. At the same time, the Gnostic answer creates its own problems. If the material world is the creation of an ignorant God, what value does material existence have? If the body is a prison for the spirit, how should we relate to embodiment? If the goal is to escape this reality, does that not lead to a rejection of ordinary life and human relationship? Different Gnostic communities answered these questions differently, but the questions themselves point to a tension at the heart of the system. Some Gnostic texts maintain a radical dualism, portraying matter as inherently inferior to spirit and advocating complete detachment from worldly concerns. Others suggest a more nuanced view in which matter is not evil but simply ignorant, capable of being illuminated by spirit. In this softer version, the material world can serve as a training ground for souls, a place where the contrast between ignorance and knowledge becomes clear, motivating the search for truth. The concept of the Archons adds another layer to the question of how the false god maintains control. The Archons are described in Gnostic texts with remarkable specificity. They have names, forms, and functions. They are associated with planets and with various aspects of fate and necessity. They are said to create impediments to the soul's ascent, demanding passwords or demonstrating power in order to bar passage through their spheres. In some texts, they are described as feeding on human emotions, sustained by the ignorance and suffering of those they rule. This imagery can be read literally as a description of actual cosmic entities. It can also be read symbolically as a representation of impersonal forces that shape human life: biological drives, social conditioning, economic systems, political structures. The Archons in this reading are whatever keeps us trapped in patterns of unconscious behavior, whatever prevents us from recognizing our freedom and our true nature. They are the systems of thought and organization that claim authority over us and that we grant authority to because we do not know better. The idea that these ruling powers feed on human energy or emotion is particularly suggestive. It implies that systems of domination are not self-sustaining, but require the participation, whether willing or unwitting, of those they dominate. The Archons need humans to remain ignorant because human belief and energy sustain our quantic reality. If enough people were to awaken, to withdraw their consent and their life force from the system, the power of the Archons would diminish. This is a profoundly subversive idea, one that reframes power not as something possessed absolutely by rulers, but as something granted by the ruled. We should note that these ancient texts do not speak of governments or institutions in the modern sense. The Gnostics were not writing about political systems or economic structures as we understand them. They were describing cosmic and spiritual realities. To read Gnostic texts as if they were criticizing Roman imperialism or predicting modern globalism is to misread them. At the same time, the symbolic power of these texts allows them to be applied metaphorically to many situations. The pattern they describe of power maintaining itself through enforced ignorance appears in many contexts across history. The Gnostic emphasis on knowledge as liberation has resonance far beyond its original religious context. The idea that truth sets you free, that seeing through illusion breaks its hold over you, that recognizing the constructed nature of authority undermines that authority. These are insights that have informed liberation movements of many kinds. Feminist theory, anti-colonial thought, critical pedagogy, and depth psychology have all, in different ways, explored how dominant systems maintain themselves by controlling knowledge, and how marginalized people can reclaim power by reclaiming their own narratives. But we must also recognize the limits of knowledge as liberation. Knowing that you are trapped does not automatically free you. Understanding the nature of a system does not immediately give you the power to change it. The Gnostics themselves acknowledged this. Gnosis was not described as a simple intellectual realization, but as a profound transformation of consciousness, often accompanied by ritual, community support, and ongoing practice. It was not enough to learn the truth. One had to become the truth, to embody it so fully that one's entire mode of being shifted. The texts from Nag Hammadi and other sources reveal a rich variety of practices associated with Gnostic communities. There were baptismal rites understood as rituals of awakening rather than cleansing from sin. There were bridal chamber ceremonies that symbolized the reunion of the soul with its divine counterpart. There were recitations of sacred names and formulas believed to grant passage through the archontic spheres. There were meditative practices aimed at direct visionary experience of the divine realm. And there were ethical teachings, often emphasizing detachment from material concerns, compassion for fellow seekers, and resistance to the claims of worldly authority. The diversity of Gnosticity. Practice reminds us that Gnosticism was never a single unified tradition. The term itself is a modern scholarly construction used to group together a wide range of movements that shared certain family resemblances but differed significantly in details. There were Christian Gnostics, Jewish Gnostics, and Gnostics who drew on both traditions without identifying exclusively with either. There were Gnostics who revered Jesus, Gnostics who revered Seth, the third son of Adam, and Gnostics who looked to other figures as bringers of knowledge. There were Gnostic systems with elaborate cosmologies involving dozens of aeons and archons, and simpler systems with more streamlined metaphysics. This diversity makes it difficult to speak of Gnostic teaching as if it were a fixed body of doctrine. What we can say is that across this diversity, certain themes recur. The distinction between the true God and the creator of this world, the presence of a divine spark in some human beings, the equation of ignorance with bondage and knowledge with freedom, and the promise of return to a divine origin beyond the material cosmos. The question of why these ideas emerged when and where they did invites historical analysis. The period in which Gnosticism flourished was a time of tremendous upheaval and anxiety in the Mediterranean world. The Roman Empire had brought political stability, but at the cost of local autonomy and cultural distinctiveness. Traditional religious systems were under pressure from new philosophical ideas and from the spread of religions like Christianity that made universal claims. People experienced dislocation, loss of meaning, and the sense that the old ways no longer made sense of experience. In such circumstances, apocalyptic and dualistic worldviews often appeal. When the world seems irredeemably wrong, the idea that it was created by an ignorant God can make more sense than the idea that it was created by a good one. When traditional authorities seem corrupt or ineffective, the claim that true knowledge comes from beyond the system, from a source that transcends institutional mediation, can be liberating. Gnosticism offered a way to maintain spiritual hope while acknowledging the depth of the world's brokenness. At the same time, Gnostic thought was not merely reactive. It was also creative and sophisticated, drawing on the best intellectual resources available and synthesizing them into new patterns of meaning. The Gnostic appropriation of Platonic philosophy, Jewish mystical tradition, and Christian revelation demonstrates a culture of serious theological and philosophical inquiry. These were not simple pessimists or escapists, but thinkers grappling with ultimate questions in rigorous and imaginative ways. The suppression of Gnostic Christianity by the institutional church was not inevitable, but once Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century, the outcome was largely determined. A state-sponsored religion requires theological uniformity and institutional hierarchy. It cannot tolerate the radical individualism and esoteric orientation of Gnostic practice. The church councils that defined Orthodox doctrine excluded Gnostic teachings. Bishops who had civil authority enforced conformity. Texts that contradicted approved scripture were destroyed. Communities that persisted in Gnostic practice were disbanded or driven underground. The Manichaean religion, which emerged in Persia in the 3rd century and spread across Asia and into Europe, can be understood as a continuation and systematization of Gnostic ideas. Manichaeism presented a fully developed dualistic cosmology in which the forces of light and darkness were locked in cosmic struggle, and in which the material world was the result of an invasion of the realm of light by the powers of darkness. Manichaean missionaries established communities from North Africa to China, creating what was for a time a genuinely world religion. But Manichaeism too faced persecution from both Christian and Zoroastrian authorities and eventually declined, surviving only in fragmentary form. The defeat of Gnosticism as an organized religious movement did not mean the complete disappearance of Gnostic ideas. Elements of Gnostic thought persisted in various esoteric and mystical traditions throughout the Middle Ages and into the modern period. The Cathars of medieval southern France held beliefs that were recognizably Gnostic, teaching a dualistic cosmology and rejecting the authority of the Roman Church. They were brutally suppressed in the Albigensian Crusade. Jewish Kabbalah developed complex cosmologies involving emanation from a hidden god that, while not Gnostic in the strict sense, share certain structural similarities with Gnostic systems. Islamic Sufism, Christian mysticism, and various Hermetic traditions all contain threads that can be traced back to, or compared with, Gnostic themes. In the modern period, interest in Gnosticism has revived significantly. The Romantic movement of the 19th century, with its emphasis on imagination, individual vision, and critique of rationalism, found Gnostic ideas appealing. Poets and philosophers explored themes of imprisonment in matter and longing for transcendence that echoed Gnostic cosmology. The rise of comparative religion as a field of study brought Gnostic texts to wider scholarly attention. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi library made primary source material available for the first time in over a millennium. In the 20th and 21st centuries, Gnostic ideas have found new audiences in unexpected places. The suspicion of institutional authority, the interest in direct spiritual experience, the sense that mainstream culture is fundamentally deceptive, these are themes that resonate with many contemporary people. Popular culture has engaged with Gnostic motifs, sometimes explicitly and sometimes unconsciously, films that depict reality as a simulation or illusion, that portray awakening from sleep into true perception, that feature rebellions against invisible ruling powers. All of these echo Gnostic narrative patterns. But we must be cautious about reading ancient Gnostic texts through modern lenses. The Gnostics were not proto-psychologists, political revolutionaries, or science fiction writers. They were religious people living in specific historical circumstances, using the conceptual and linguistic tools available to them to articulate their understanding of the sacred. To fully appreciate Gnostic thought requires entering into their world, understanding their concerns on their own terms, and resisting the temptation to make them say what we wish they had said. At the same time, texts and ideas have lives beyond their original contexts. Once written down, they can be read and reinterpreted by communities far removed in time and space from those that produced them. The Gnostic texts speak to perennial human questions about the nature of reality, the problem of suffering, and the possibility of liberation. In this sense, they remain living documents, capable of generating new insights and applications. The psychological reading of Gnostic cosmology mentioned earlier deserves further exploration, as it represents one of the most fruitful modern engagements with these ancient ideas. When we speak of the demiurge as ego and the archons as psychological complexes, we are proposing that what the Gnostics described as cosmic forces might also be understood as forces within the individual psyche. This does not mean that the cosmic reading is wrong, only that it is not the only possible reading. In psychological terms, the ego is the center of conscious identity. It is what we normally mean when we say I. The ego develops through childhood as the individual learns to distinguish self from other, to navigate social reality and to meet basic needs. The ego is necessary for functioning in the world. But the ego also has limitations. It identifies with particular roles, beliefs, and narratives. It defends itself against perceived threats. It constructs a version of reality that centers itself and that protects its own continuity. In doing so, the ego can become rigid, defensive, and cut off from deeper sources of meaning and vitality. The demiurge's claim to be the highest god parallels the ego's assumption that it is the totality of the self. Just as the demiurge does not know of the true god beyond him, the ego does not recognize the deeper self. Just as the demiurge creates a world based on his limited vision, the ego constructs a personal reality based on its limited perspective. And just as the demiurge's creation becomes a prison for divine sparks, the ego's constructions can become prisons for authentic experience. The archons, in this reading, are the various subpersonalities and conditioning patterns that support the ego's rule. They are the internalized voices of authority that tell us who we should be, what we should want, and how we should live. They are the habitual emotional reactions that seem to arise automatically, beyond our conscious control. They are the repetitive thoughts that keep us locked in familiar grooves of feeling and behavior. Each of these patterns has a kind of autonomy, seeming to act on its own, and together they constitute what we might call the architecture of the conditioned self. Liberation, then, is the process of recognizing these patterns as patterns, seeing through the ego's claim to ultimacy, and making contact with a deeper source of awareness. This deeper awareness is not constructed by the ego, and does not depend on it. It is the consciousness that witnesses thoughts and emotions without being identical to them. It is the spacious awareness within which all experience arises. In Jungian terms, it is the self, the true center of the psyche. In Buddhist terms, it might be called original mind or Buddha nature. In Gnostic terms, it is the divine spark, the pneuma, the spirit that comes from beyond the created world. The journey to this recognition is not simple or straightforward. It requires what spiritual traditions often call awakening, a shift in identification from the conditioned self to unconditioned awareness. This shift cannot be forced or achieved through willpower, because willpower itself is a function of the ego. It requires a kind of surrender, a willingness to let go of familiar identifications and to rest in not knowing. It often involves what mystics call the dark night, a period of disorientation and loss of meaning, as old structures of self dissolve before new ones have fully emerged. This psychological reading does not exhaust the meaning of Gnostic texts, but it does make them accessible and relevant to modern seekers who may not relate to ancient cosmological categories, but who do recognize the experience of feeling trapped in limited and limiting patterns of thought and being. It suggests that the Gnostic drama of fall and redemption is not only a story about cosmic history, but also a story about individual development, a map of the journey from unconscious identification to conscious awareness. The philosophical dimension of Gnostic thought also continues to provoke reflection. The question of reality versus illusion, of appearance versus truth, is as alive today as it was in Plato's time. We might ask, what is the status of the world we experience? Is it ultimately real, or is it in some sense a construction, a projection, a simulation? Modern physics, with its revelations about the strange nature of matter at quantum scales and the role of observation in determining outcomes, has raised these questions in new forms. Philosophers of mind debate whether consciousness is produced by material processes or whether matter itself is a phenomenon arising within consciousness. These are not the same questions these Gnostics were asking, but they are related. They all point to a fundamental uncertainty about the nature of reality and to the possibility that what seems obviously real may not be what it seems. The Gnostic answer was clear. The material world is not ultimate reality, but a derivative realm, a shadow or copy of something truer and more fundamental. That answer may not satisfy in a scientific age, but the question it responds to remains urgent. The ethical implications of Gnostic thought are complex and contested. On one hand, the devaluation of the material world and the emphasis on escape from it can lead to a withdrawal from moral responsibility. If the world is the flawed creation of an ignorant God, why work to improve it? If the goal is to transcend this reality, why concern yourself with justice, compassion, or the alleviation of suffering within it? Some Gnostic groups apparently drew these conclusions, adopting either extreme asceticism or, conversely, libertinism on the grounds that actions in the material realm were spiritually irrelevant. On the other hand, many Gnostic texts do contain ethical teaching, emphasizing compassion for fellow seekers, resistance to unjust authority, and detachment from ego-driven desires. The recognition that others also contain divine sparks can ground a profound sense of solidarity and mutual respect. The resistance to false authority can motivate prophetic critique of oppressive systems. The practice of detachment can free one from the compulsive drives that fuel greed, violence, and exploitation. Perhaps the most challenging aspect of Gnostic ethics is the tension between withdrawal and engagement. If the world is fundamentally flawed, should one retreat into contemplation and inner work, or should one engage with the world in an attempt to alleviate suffering, even knowing that ultimate redemption lies elsewhere? Different Gnostic communities and individuals have answered this question differently, and the tension itself may be irresolvable within the logic of the system. In bringing this exploration toward a close, we must return to the central question implied by the title. How did this reality fall under the control of a false god? The Gnostic answer, as we have seen, is not a historical account in the ordinary sense, but a mythological and symbolic narrative. It tells of a cosmic error, an act of creation undertaken in ignorance, resulting in a world that reflects its creator's limitation. It describes how divine sparks came to be trapped in this flawed creation, and how the rulers of this world work to keep those sparks ignorant of their true nature. But perhaps more important than the mythological narrative is the experiential reality it points to. Many people across times and cultures have felt that something fundamental is wrong with the world as it is. They have sensed that beneath those surface appearances lies a deeper truth, obscured by layers of conditioning, authority, and illusion. They have experienced moments of awakening, brief glimpses of a reality more vivid and meaningful than ordinary consciousness allows. The Gnostic myths give form to this experience, offering a framework within which it makes sense. Whether one accepts the Gnostic cosmology literally, reads it symbolically, interprets it psychologically, or engages with it philosophically, the core insight remains provocative. That reality as we experience it may not be ultimate reality, that the authorities we take for granted may not be what they claim, and that liberation requires a fundamental shift in consciousness, a movement from ignorance to knowledge, from sleep to awakening. This is not a claim that can be proven or disproven in any conventional sense. It is a stance, a way of orienting oneself to existence. To adopt it is to commit to a path of questioning, of not accepting appearances at face value, of seeking truth beyond received narratives. It is to entertain seriously the possibility that we are, in some sense, asleep in a world that passes for reality, but that is not our true home. The Gnostic vision is undeniably dark in some respects. It offers little comfort to those who wish to believe that the world is fundamentally good or that suffering serves a benevolent purpose. It suggests that much of what we take for granted as natural or necessary is actually the result of cosmic error or deliberate deception. It can foster a sense of alienation, a feeling of being a stranger in a strange land. Yet there is also something hopeful at the heart of Gnostic teaching. The very fact that we can question reality, that we can conceive of something beyond it, that we can recognize ignorance for what it is. All of this points to the presence of something within us that transcends the limited creation we find ourselves in. The divine spark is not extinguished, only hidden. Knowledge is possible. Liberation is real. The false god's kingdom endures only as long as its subjects mistake it for the only kingdom there is. In the end, the Gnostic texts invite us to consider what we take to be real and why we take it to be real. They ask whether the authorities that structure our lives, whether religious, political, or psychological, deserve the power we grant them. They suggest that the deepest truth is not found in external doctrine or institutional mediation, but in direct inner knowing. And they promise that those who undertake the difficult work of awakening will find that what they took to be the whole of reality is only a small and distorted part of a much greater whole. These ideas are challenging, and they have been challenged. They do not represent the mainstream of Western religious thought. They were rejected by Orthodox Christianity and suppressed for centuries. Yet they have survived, transmitted through hidden channels, preserved in buried texts, and now available again for those who seek them. Whether as historical documents, religious teachings, psychological maps, or philosophical provocations, the Gnostic texts continue to speak. They speak to anyone who has ever felt that the world is not as it should be, that beneath the surface of ordinary life lies something more real and more true. They speak to those who distrust institutional authority, and who sense that official narratives often conceal as much as they reveal. They speak to seekers of direct experience, to contemplatives and mystics, to anyone drawn to the possibility of transcendence. But they also caution us, the path of gnosis is not easy or safe. To question everything is to risk losing familiar moorings. To seek truth beyond the system is to place oneself outside the protections the system offers. To identify the divine spark within is to take responsibility for nurturing it, for protecting it from the forces that would extinguish or co-opt it. Knowledge, the Gnostics understood, is both liberation and burden. The story of how this reality fell under the control of a false god is ultimately a story about forgetfulness and remembering. We forgot who we were, where we came from, and what we are capable of. We accepted the claims of limited powers and mistook them for ultimate truth. We became so accustomed to our chains that we no longer felt them. But the possibility of remembering remains. The spark can be rekindled. The sleeper can awaken, and in that awakening the false god's kingdom begins to lose its hold. This is the promise and the challenge of the Gnostic vision. It is not a comfortable teaching. It does not offer easy answers or simple solutions. It does not promise that awakening will make life easier or that knowledge will solve all problems. What it offers is the possibility of seeing truly, of recognizing reality for what it is, and of finding within oneself a source of light that no external power can extinguish. Whether one accepts this vision as literal truth, metaphorical insight, psychological wisdom, or philosophical speculation, the questions it raises are worth considering. What is the nature of reality? What is the source of suffering? What are the limits of institutional authority? What does it mean to know truly? How do we distinguish truth from illusion? These are questions that every thinking person must grapple with in one form or another. The Gnostic texts, for all their strangeness and difficulty, offer one set of answers. They tell us that reality is layered, that appearances deceive, that power and truth are not the same thing, and that liberation comes through knowledge. They warn us against mistaking the creator of this world for the ultimate source of all being, and they assure us that within each person who seeks, there exists already the light that can guide them home. In a world that often seems designed to keep us distracted, divided, and disempowered, these ancient teachings retain their subversive power. They remind us that we are more than we have been told we are, that the world is stranger than authorizes narratives allow, and that truth is worth seeking even when the search is difficult and the destination uncertain. The false god's kingdom endures as long as we consent to it, as long as we accept its version of reality without question. But consent can be withdrawn, questions can be asked, and in the space that opens when old certainties dissolve, new possibilities emerge. This is what the Gnostic tradition offers. Not a final answer, but an invitation to question. Not a complete system, but a set of tools for seeing through systems. Not a guarantee of salvation, but a path toward greater awareness. Whether that path leads where the ancient Gnostics believed it led, to reunion with a transcendent divine source beyond all creation, or whether it leads to some other destination, perhaps one not yet imagined, the journey itself remains worthwhile. For in learning to see through the illusions that bind us, we recover something essential: the capacity to think for ourselves, to trust our own deepest knowing, and to live as conscious participants in reality rather than as unconscious subjects of forces we do not understand. The story of the false god's kingdom is not finished. It continues wherever people mistake power for truth, wherever institutions claim authority they have not earned, wherever individuals forget their own capacity for direct knowing. And the story of resistance to that kingdom also continues, in every act of genuine questioning, in every moment of authentic awareness, in every choice to value truth over comfort or convenience. The Gnostic vision, for all its ancient origins, speaks to the eternal present, to the moment in which each person must decide what they will believe, whom they will trust, and who they will become.